so much for joining us today on the Fast Ride. My name is Angie Henderson, and welcome to your first stop. We're going to be discussing the first B of trafficking at this stop, which is the bot. So I am a professor of sociology at the University of Northern Colorado, and I'm also the lead data analyst and training coordinator for the Avery Center for Research and Services. You will hear from my co-founder, Megan Lundstrom, at the next stop, so get jazzed for that. But for now, I want to tell you a little bit about the victims involved and the survivors involved in the commercial sex industry. I want to challenge you to think a little bit differently and sort of dive a little bit deeper into what we commonly mistake as trafficking as a whole. Oftentimes when people think of trafficking, one of the first things that comes to mind is this idea that it happens only overseas and it's women or it's children. Mostly people think that it involves only children who are kidnapped and taken, just like Liam Neeson would suggest in those movies. But in reality, it's not that way. As a researcher, I've interviewed over 70 victims and survivors of sex trafficking. And I've also walked alongside victims and survivors of sex trafficking in my work at the Avery Center. And it happens here in your community. Anytime there's a vulnerability, whether it's economic instability, a natural disaster like unfortunately the fire that y'all have been dealing with very recently. And it happens to all ages. There are lots of stats that people throw around about the average age of entry into sex trafficking. And while those numbers suggest like mid-teens is when people suggest they enter, we also know that it impacts adult women and adult individuals as well. And it's incredibly hard to leave. And I'm going to talk about that in the next myth I want to bust for you. So one of the questions we hear a lot in this work is this question of, well, if you're an adult and you're being trafficked, why don't you just leave? If you're being physically abused by your pimp or your trafficker, why don't you just take off? And the reality is domestic pimp-controlled sex trafficking meets all 15 characteristics of a cultic group. What that means is it is incredibly hard to break out of the brainwashing that the trafficker has so carefully instilled in his victims. And the other thing is victims do try to escape. On average, it takes between 6 and 12 attempts for a victim to actually successfully exit the situation. And it's incredibly dangerous. Many are harmed, physically abused, or even killed during their attempts to escape. So you're going to hear next at the next stop from Megan about the business of trafficking. And I would just encourage you between stops to think about how you may know somebody who is vulnerable to exploitation. Y'all, you'd be so surprised at the things that pimps do with their victims. I've heard over and over that they went to church. Some victims were allowed to go to school and appeared completely normal. And if you were to ask any of those victims at that time, are you a victim of trafficking? Do you need help? Do we need to call, the FBI? Chances are, because of the brainwashing, they're not going to say yes. They don't. Many victims do not identify as victims until long after they've exited and are steeped in their healing and start to realize what had actually happened during that trauma. So I want you to think about ways that you might be able to just sort of adjust and pivot your worldview and your perspective on trafficking. And don't think that it's just kiddos overseas. It's not just foreigners put in shipping containers. It's not Liam Neeson trying to rescue his daughter. That's really not how this works. It is adults. It is people who seemingly appear on the outside to be independent. But what's going on behind the scenes is really, really dark in a lot of ways. And I would just encourage you to think about that a little bit differently. So you're going to hear from Megan next, the co-founder of the Avery Center for Research and Services. Both of us will be around at the end of your ride to answer any questions that you have. So take notes. If you have any questions, write them down, jot them down. now before you start onto your next stop, and come and find us at the end. We're really looking forward to connecting to people, and we would love to have more conversations and answer any questions that you might have. Enjoy the rest of your ride. I'll see you at the next stop, and I will absolutely see you at the end. Thanks, y'all. Have fun.